Hi, this is Ashwin again, and I want to take you through a few videos to introduce you to the behavior design canvas and get you started on working with the canvas. In this video, I want to focus on why design for behavioral change in the first place, um, and why and what is the link between behavioral change and digital technology. Now, usually when we think of technology, we tend to think of it as something digital or electronic or mechanical. We take the term technology for granted, but in order to understand the relationship between human behavior and technology, we need to zoom out a little bit and look at technology as something much broader. We need to look at technology as anything that empowers human beings, that gives them agency. And fire is a technology, essentially. Now, out of fire comes the emergent behavior of community, for example. Um, if you look at farming as a technology, out of the technology called farming, we developed behaviors around settling and helped humans settle in previously uninhabitable places. Paper can be considered a technology, and of the many kinds of behaviors that were shaped around paper, learning was only one of them, which was enabled by um, paper's ability to encode and transmit and distribute knowledge and information. The pill can be considered a form of technology, and the pill gave a gender unprecedented levels of independence and empowerment than ever before. So, in this way, you see that technology and human behavior actually are somehow almost part and parcel of each other, and successful technologies end up changing human behavior, and human behavior kind of um, ends up reinforcing or making successful technology even more widespread. Now, the latest version of technology is what we consider digital technology, and the latest embodiment of digital technology is this device that all of us carry around, which is called the smartphone. And the smartphone has given rise to a very wide range of behaviors, such as the selfie, which on an individualistic level, but it's also given rise to a lot of cultural or social behaviors. It has created the basis or the kind of like the infrastructure for widespread digital, social movements, such as protest, and it has also helped us come together as fellow social beings, and plays an important role in things like celebrations and festivals and all kinds of social occasions and so on. So we see this kind of common pattern, which was kind of encapsulated by McLuhan in his famous aphorism, where he says that, first we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. So far we've seen how um, technology and behavior in general influence and kind of shape each other. Let's look at some more specific digital behaviors that are shaped around digital technology. Look at some examples here. If you look at most successful disruptive products that have become billion-dollar industries or more, you essentially see that there's been a behavioral shaping that's been going on. If you look at what we used to call photography before digital and what we do as photography after digital, these two behavioral patterns are very different, even though we still call it photography. And before digital, essentially, we used to shoot photographs. We would develop those pictures in a lab using specialized equipment, usually with the help of a specialist. We'd display those pictures, physical artifacts, and store them and pull them out and show them to friends and relatives. Now, what we do as photography in the digital domain is very different. We kind of shoot pictures. We instantly have editorial capabilities, quite advanced ones. We are able to edit and share these photographs, these images almost instantaneously with a worldwide community, and have social commenting and all sorts of social interactive features and behaviors around images. Um, if you look at, let's say, ride hailing, another disrupted industry, and a very large one right now. Essentially, what we did before digital was we used to walk to a cab. Remember those days? We'd actually call a cab, you'd wave to a cab, you'd ride into a cab, and then you'd ride with a cab, and then you'd kind of pay the cab after. That would be at the end of the transaction. You'd probably never see that driver again. Now you essentially do some advanced mapping function. You You pick the cab that you want, you build a sort of trust with the driver based on their description and even how they look maybe, and then you pay up front, you take the ride, and then you kind of rate the whole ride and have maybe even a social conversation around the ride, and the transaction actually carries on for much longer and has a sort of continuity which we didn't have earlier before. So the disruptors around ride hailing have fundamentally changed, and that in my opinion, that is my fundamental argument as being the real disruption. The disruption is happening in terms of behavior, not in terms of just the technology. If you look at what's happening with dating, you remember the days when you'd actually go to an event, meet someone, or rather you'd have to wait till you went to an event to meet someone and talk to them and probably figure out if they're interested in going out on a date with you. But now you can build a very elaborate profile down to your eyeballs and describe what you're looking for as a human being and shalala, and then we do some strange swiping behavior online, and then instantaneously there are matches, and then finally you end up going on a date with someone. The whole set of behaviors around what we call dating have changed fundamentally, and it's an interesting point here to see that it's not like when behavioral disruption happens through digital, like the older behaviors entirely die off. It's like you have a whole new set of behaviors that begin to emerge that complement the older behaviors. There are still people who would wave to a cab. There are still instances when you go out and meet someone in a party. Of course these things happen, but then you have a whole new set of emergent behaviors which drive the adoption of that technology. There are also behaviors in the digital world which are appropriated or borrowed or extensions of behavior from the real world, and swiping is one of those behaviors. I like to think of swiping as a sort of digital swiping, as a sort of extension of the real world swiping that people do when they enter a social space and look around quite unconsciously and swipe potential dates on or off, or left and right, and say, well, this person looks interesting and this person doesn't, and what Tinder has done is in some ways kind of take that physical behavioral instantiation and turned it into a digital interaction. You see this happening all the time. So wellness is a space which is a kind of a health and wellness that's being disrupted right now by the introduction of new behaviors and new technologies such as wearable devices. So what used to happen before these devices came along was that the typical behavioral pattern was that we'd kind of have some sort of a symptom, a physical symptom. We'd probably stress about it. We'd probably schedule a meeting with a consultant or a doctor and then consult them and then, medicate based on their instructions. But now you can be much more preemptive, you can be much more anticipatory by buying one of these devices, wearing those devices, and then referring to those devices on an ongoing basis, and then kind of helping that device kind of even preempt and improve your health as you go along. So that's a real paradigm shift when it comes to behaviors around wellness and health. There's also a huge paradigm shift happening in terms of conversational devices which impact our shopping behavior, for example. Conversational interfaces and personal assistants are obviously set to change our behavioral patterns in many areas, but shopping is one of them. That's one of those low-hanging fruit. So what used to happen before these things came along was that you'd actually make an event out of walking to a particular store or location where you needed to shop. You'd browse for a product, you'd actually pick the product and pay and carry that product back home. But now the behaviors look more like you're in a conversation, and the need for a product kind of comes up in context of that conversation. You place an order probably without even being very conscious of it, and then you kind of you have the product home delivered, and then you kind of use the product and rate it or build some sort of a loyalty with the brand. So this is like again a huge paradigm shift that's happening in terms of the behaviors that we are kind of developing in the shopping area. So digital products and services, whether they are VR, in-car systems, in-house systems, wearable devices, virtual assistants, what have you, digital products and services are now more and more fundamentally about driving human behavioral change. And if you look at like the engagement path on a very high level, it's very easy to get interrupted by digital technology, and engagement actually is already quite hard. But in order to retain customers, in order to develop long-term relationships with customers and users, we are looking at behavior as the driving force, and behavioral change is the driving element there, which can then hopefully lead to monetization or impact if you're an impact driven organization. So the behavioral design approach is essentially about starting to design the behavior rather than the technology. And behavior design is a complementary discipline to user experience design, to customer experience design, to service design, to interaction design. All of that stuff, product and industrial design, all of that stuff remains at the table. And behavioral design is essentially about bringing this behavioral thinking to the table. It's another slice in the design pie, is how I would put it. And so the problem with behavioral design is that if you look into behavioral science, it's a very large and complex domain. There's decades of history. There's tons of research. There's many areas, and what we need are frameworks. What we need are accessible models to help us sense make our way into this plethora of wealth of knowledge and research that's out there. And that's the reason essentially that I kind of synthesized this canvas. And another reason to essentially have to reduce the complexity is to also keep an eye on the unintended consequences that technology can have on human behavior. For example, social media is supposed to be social in nature, and it's supposed to connect human beings, and we've ended up with social media sometimes which essentially ends up isolating people. So technology can often have unintended consequences. There can also be positive unintended consequences, such as game designers who probably made Pokemon Go probably didn't realize, and I'm not sure if they did, and it's great if they did, but they probably didn't realize that the game would end up making lonely streets busy, and kind of spark connection between people in areas where they wouldn't have expected to run into each other chasing Pokemon. So the behavior design canvas is really trying to is two things. Its intention is twofold. One is to kind of reduce that complexity of behavioral science down, and make that behavioral science kind of accessible through a certain pathway, through a certain framework of understanding behavioral change and designing behavioral change. And the second intention is really to help minimize those unintended consequences, so that there is a clear intention and design behind the behaviors that we want to impact, and then we are able to visualize that intention and actually go about making that behavioral intervention, and then measuring if it's actually happening. So I'll leave you with this thought that if you are thinking about behavioral change and behavior design, then essentially start your projects. Don't bring this in as an afterthought, but start your projects with the thinking around what is the behavioral change that your project or intervention would like to create. And that's it for this video. Thanks very much. Bye.